Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Love, and I'm here today to talk about different kinds of explanations, those that preserve history and those that erase it. This is about my 20th presentation at Balticon, so I've been doing this for quite some time. This is my first time doing it virtually, and so I'd like you to forgive me for any glitches that occur during this process. I want to start by mentioning that although I don't have a book myself to wave as a thing to boast about, my wife does have a children's fantasy available on Amazon. It's The Pegasus Potential, and it's available for the low price of 99 cents. So I encourage anyone who's interested in flying horses to give that a try. I also do have something else to boast about on my own account. Last week, I had a story appear on Daily Science Fiction, and if I'm doing this right, it should be appearing on your screen. And now I'll start my presentation. Let's see, share screen. So there are two kinds of explanations for natural phenomena, historical events, and really anything else that happens in the world that we see. There are the kinds of explanations that preserve history and the kinds of explanations that erase it. I'm going to illustrate that, first of all, with an example that I've used before. Imagine you have a cup, a bin, something, and you have two marbles in it, a red marble and a green marble. Close your eyes, put your hand in, pick out a marble at random. If it's a red marble, put it back and add a green marble to the bin. If it's green, put the green one back and add a red marble. In both cases, you're going to end up with three marbles in the bin, either two green or two and one red, or two red and one green. What if you do that 100,000 more times? What is the final percentage of red marbles that you get? After a lot of variation in the beginning, you end up with almost exactly 50% red marbles. And we can talk about the reason why that is, but before we even introduce the subject of why you end up with 50% red marbles in this case, let's look at the reversed rules. Now, if you take out a red marble, you put the original red marble back and another red marble. And if you take out a green marble, you add the original green marble and another green marble. Do that again 100,000 times or 1,000,000 times. What's the final number of red marbles? And we get a different answer. This time, after a lot of variation at the beginning, it settles down to about 0.27 or 27%. Well, that's an interesting number. That's about 3/11. That's about 10% of the base of the natural logarithms. But why is that what comes up? And it turns out that the answer to that question is very different than the answer to the first question. And we'll see that when we look at what happens if you do the same example, the same simulation of the reversed rules 1,000,000 times. You will see that the final result can literally be anything between 0 and 1. The proportion of red marbles to total marbles could be almost 0. It could be 50-50. It could be 0.27. It could be almost 100%. Anything is possible. The answer to the question of why you ended up with 0.27 as the proportion of red marbles to total marbles in the original one that I ran is nothing more or less than because that's how you happen to draw marbles out in the early part of the experiment, and the process just naturally locked on to that result. For the original set of rules, you'll notice that the final answer is almost always exactly 0.5. So we're looking for a very different kind of answer. It's not going to be chance drove you to a situation that fed back on itself and locked in at a random number between 0 and 1. Here, it always ends up around 0.5. So that's a very different kind of answer. If we do the math of these processes, and we look at the number of marbles after a step, number of red marbles after a step versus the total number of marbles after a step, for the first process, the number of red marbles after a step is equal to the number of red marbles before plus 1 minus the previous ratio. And that's all over the total number of marbles before plus 1, because you end up adding a marble no matter what happens. Process 2, the number of red marbles after you've done a step is the number of red marbles before plus the previous ratio, not 1 minus the previous ratio, but just the previous ratio. And if you work through the implications of that math, you see that for process 1, you are guaranteed to end up in the stable situation of having the total number of marbles is twice the number of red marbles. Whereas in the other case, process 2, you end up with the number of red marbles equals the number of red marbles. Anything is possible. Any ratio can happen depending on the history. In fact, when I did this experiment by putting an initial number of 100 red marbles and 1 green marble in, and I ran it through process 1, I got, after a million steps, 50-50, whereas for process 2, when I ran a million steps, I ended up with just essentially 100% red marbles. The history of what happened was erased in process 1, whereas the history of what happened was preserved in process 2. We can summarize that by saying that in one process, you have the effects of chance averaging out, leading to a predictable result, whereas in the history preserving process, the effects of chance continue to shape the results for all time. It's not predictable beforehand. Anything could have happened, but once something starts happening, it will tend to keep happening. Or if you want to look at it in literary terms, the history erasing process is like Damon Runyon said, the race is not always to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, but that's the way to bet. Whereas the history preserving process is like Ecclesiastes. The race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, but time and chance happen to them all. If you don't remember to distinguish between these two types of processes, you will end up very confused when you look for explanations of things in the world. And that's what the rest of this talk is going to be about. So I've given you the motivating example in my outline. And now I'm going to go into some detailed discussion. I'll talk about more characteristics of these two processes and explanations. I will give you some fictional examples just because I find them interesting, and talk about how to make this distinction in real life and how it affects skepticism, since this is part of the skeptic program. Finally, I'll talk about something that could be considered a third type of explanation, or might be not considered an explanation at all, and give you some references and closing thoughts. So why is this distinction important? You can get very confused, and people historically have gotten very confused if they look for an inevitable answer to a historic question or a historic answer to a law-based question. So why are planets round? There's a law-based answer to that. Gravity makes planets round. No matter what shape an original body has, if it's big enough, it's going to end up round after a certain amount of time. On the other hand, why do Americans drive on the right side of the road? That's a historical question. The contingent facts of history led Americans to drive on the right side of the road, whereas in the United Kingdom, people drive on the left side of the road. There's no natural law that says if you live on North America, you will naturally end up driving on the right side of the law. It's just that you'll get arrested if you don't nowadays. So contingent processes often have short-term predictability. The weather today is not going to be too different from the weather tomorrow, probably. History-erasing processes have predictable and stable endpoints. Things end up in a particular place and they tend to stay there. Both kinds of processes involve reasons for events. But what do you even think of? What is a satisfying reason? What even counts as a reason for something? History-erasing answers are satisfying because they provide order and inevitability. However, some people would consider them dissatisfying because they lack drama and they tend to erase the interesting details of history. History preserving reasons are satisfying because they provide a story. There's a story to why Americans drive on the right side of the road, whereas there's not really a story to why planets are round. However, history preserving reasons are dissatisfying because they are contingent, and some people don't like contingent answers, and because the whole story is almost always unknown. So you're never quite sure that you understand the cause completely. Having two kinds of answers gives us new null hypotheses. Before looking for a history-erasing cause of a phenomena, you should ask yourself if there is an historical reason that's sufficient to explain it. And before looking for an historical reason, you need to consider whether there's a history-erasing reason for it. The goal is always to not waste time looking for stories or laws that don't exist because you've misunderstood whether you're looking at a process that's historical or not. And looking in the wrong place is something that really does happen. Johannes Kepler was an interesting case. He was a brilliant man who did excellent work in astronomy, and he really thought he understood the reason why there were exactly 6 planets and why they were located exactly where they are. He thought that since there are 5 platonic solids, that provides 6 spaces if you nest those planets, nest those solids one inside the next. And that therefore means, since the universe couldn't be built in any way other than a way that respects the platonic solids as vital, 6 planets have to exist. But of course, nowadays we do understand, and looking at all the exosolar planets that have been discovered, that the number of planets is an historical fact. The way that bodies combined in the early days of the solar system determined the fact that there are, in fact, 8 planets, or many more than 8, depending on whether you like Pluto or not a preordained fact that relates back to geometry. The existence, however, of a two-party system in the United States is a law-based result, however. Which 2 parties is an historical question, but having 2 parties is a natural result of the first-past-the-post voting system that the United States has. If you look up something called Diverger's law, you'll see that this is one of the cases where there really is a sociological explanation for something that makes firm predictions. And when you have a first-past-the-post system, you will end up with 2 parties dominating and not 3 or more. Different sciences are sometimes associated with different preferred explanation styles. Physics is the canonical explanation of a science that has historyless explanations. But in spite of that, there are some physics questions that have contingent explanations. The thickness of Earth's atmosphere is an historical question. While the mass of the Earth and its magnetic field and its distance from the sun influence how well the Earth hold onto an atmosphere, it's an historical question about how much atmosphere there was in the first place. Earth's atmosphere is a product of historical accidents, like the collision with the Mars-sized protoplanet Theia, which probably stripped all of Earth's existing atmosphere away entirely at that point. If Theia had hit Venus instead of Earth, Earth would have a thicker atmosphere than it does now, and Venus would probably have a much thinner atmosphere than it does now. That's just the way history happened. Biology is the canonical example of a historical science, but still there are some historyless processes going on there too. There's no story to the fact that human-sized insects don't exist. The square cube law is the answer, not any historical process. Let's see. Negative versus positive feedback is an important part of this distinction between history and history-erasing processes and history-preserving ones. Negative feedback, like we saw in the marble example, generally erases the history of a process, taking the system to a predetermined stable state. This isn't always true. If you look at Newton's method for determining the roots of an equation, you can get chaotic results. But it's generally true that negative feedback will erase history, whereas positive feedback tends to reinforce historical accidents. However, you can predict that if you have positive feedback in a microphone system, you will get a repeatable, painful noise. So I can't say that positive feedback always is unpredictable. A mixture of positive and negative feedback, which you find a lot in the world, can lead to preserving history in some senses and erasing it in others. Another way to talk about this distinction is to talk about memoryless processes versus non-memoryless processes. A memoryless process has no history. The behavior depends entirely on the current state of the system, like radioactive decay. A radium 226 atom has a half-life of 1600 years, no matter how long it's existed up until that point. It could have been created a moment ago. It could have been created at the beginning of the solar system. The chances are that we'll have a half-life from now of 1600 years. Non-memoryless processes are much more familiar to us. Time to failure usually depends on the age and thus the history of an object, like a human body, unfortunately. History erasure is also analogous to the concept of what you might call substrate erasure, substrate independence. You see flocking in birds and flocking in fish. The flocking behavior looks very similar in both fish and birds, even though fish and birds are very different things and they're operating in the water or in the air, which are very different environments. Turns out that some very simple rules about how the birds or fish interact with each other are enough to replicate flocking behavior. And the ideal glass law is another case of substrate erasure. The same law describes all gases reasonably well, regardless of the differences in how the molecules interact with each other, in the size of the molecules. We had the ideal glass law a long time before we even knew that that molecules existed. So that law really does not depend on the intimate details of what molecules are like to any great extent. Sometimes, however, the substrate does matter. And if we have time at the end of this talk, I'm going to show you a cool video of what's called a chain fountain, where it's a phenomenon that does seem to depend on the details of the chain. And if I don't get to it, by all means, Google chain fountain and take a look. It's just cool. Now, when people are designing systems, they are almost always trying to create a history-erasing system. You want a system that does the same thing, the thing that it's supposed to do, regardless of history. You don't want how your hammer works this time to be affected by how how it worked the last time, the fact that you used it on wood instead of metal last time, you don't want that to affect how it works the next time. When there is a system that has a history, you build in a way to erase that history so you can get back to a starting state, like rebooting a computer or shaking an Etch-a-Sketch until you get back to your original null state. Magical systems in fiction are often described as being inherently and often and usually unusually contingent. You have an initial bad influence because you built on a gravesite that was there 10,000 years ago, and that curses you no matter how long ago the gravesite was dug. And that's similar to the way that homeopathy is described as working. And you have to wonder if homeopathy means that water has memory, why doesn't water remember everything that's ever been in it, and not just the thing that the homeopath recently put in it and wants to have an effect on you. Some more real world examples. Linguistics is a lovely, fun field full of contingent events. For example, we use a word that used to mean room for an app on our phone that takes pictures. Camera comes from the word for room. There's a historical reason for that. The way that cameras were built and understood meant that you were talking about a room, and so you just kept that word going forward. That's an historical accident. In German, at least, there's a more straightforward term, Fotoapparat, which obviously just means something that has to do with light, a light device. That's a history-erasing term for camera. Although even in German, they have the word camera for the same reason that we do. So you can make your alternate history better by using contingent terms. In Charles Strauss's family trade books, there are a group of people who talk about a corpuscular petard instead of an atomic bomb. And in Harry Turtledove's World War series, they say explosive metal bomb instead of atomic bomb for historical reasons. And that's a way of giving very similar to an alternate history, because a different history will have different terminology based on how terminology evolves out of what's going on in the society at that time. There are some law-based issues with linguistics. I don't think there's any real story behind most individual insulting terms starting with Indian or Dutch or French. There's just a general tendency of British people and American people to insult people from other nations. I'm sure they do it to us too. And if you're looking for a particular historical event that explains the term French leave or French postcards, I don't think there is one. I think it's just that when you want to come up with a euphemism for a certain type of behavior, people grab the first stereotype they had about the French or the Dutch or the Native Americans to use in that case. Similarly, there seems to be a law about how verbs regularize. They seem to regularize with a half-life that's related to how frequently the words are used. So a word like hurt is still irregular. It's a commonly used word. We don't say hurted, we say hurt in the past tense. Whereas there used to be a past tense for the verb help. It used to be help, hope for the past tense, and that has been completely regularized. No one would say hope anymore; they say helped. And that you can a very interesting paper looked at all sorts of verbs that were irregular in earlier versions of English and then began to become regularized. They predict that the verb that we're going to lose next in terms of its irregular sense is to wed. We will say, and nowadays you can use either wed in the past tense or wedded, and both are acceptable. At some point, only wedded will be acceptable. Some fictional examples of history erasing, just because I found them to be cool. A recent episode of Doctor Who suggested that the process of humans becoming and developing cybermenization is a natural endpoint for humankind. You don't have to assume that all Cybermen come from an ancestral source. If you give people technology and put them in circumstances where it makes sense, they will develop Cybermen. Stephen Baxter has the same process going on with a hive-like structure for human society. Given the right circumstances, people will fall into a hive society. Larry Niven's Ringworld has that sort of thing on the Ringworld itself. In ecological niches where there's a mountain, you will develop a mountain dwelling species that will look very similar to the other mountain dwelling species that they're not directly related to. It's just a case of convergent evolution. Fandom itself may be a natural end state for human interaction. There's a very cool paper I have a link to about a Civil War era children's magazine with a letter column, and it developed flame wars and all sorts of the usual what we think of fantasy interactions that developed in our subculture in the 30s and 40s in the 1860s. I'm avoiding using the words chaos and attractor in this case, but by all means, I am aware of the connection to those concepts. I just didn't want to get into that whole subject. But if you want to rewrite my sentences above and say Stephen Baxter has human hives as an attractor in the human society state, then that's fine with me. Oops. All right. Another case of history erasing and history preserving processes is why particular jobs are associated with particular groups of people. Most often, I would say that that's a history erasing process. There's just some sort of contingent event that put a certain group of people in a particular job, and that they reinforce that because people's choice of careers is naturally influenced by families and friends, creating a positive feedback loop that creates a concentration of a certain, say, an ethnic group in a particular field. For example, there are a lot of Vietnamese nail salon owners. That's not because there's some law-based affinity between being Vietnamese and being a nail salon owner. It's because that there was an historical event. Tippi Hedren met with a group of Vietnamese refugees. They were interested in her nails because it was something that struck their interest. And Tippi Hedren had her manicurist teach a bunch of people how to do nail work, and also help them start businesses. The rest was history. There are some history erasing cases in professions too. You will find a lot of funeral directors are also furniture makers, particularly in the 19th century, but in some cases still carrying on to today. And that's because in a lot of places in the world, when funerals started being done outside the home, the people who picked up that job were the people who were building coffins, and the people who were building coffins were the people who had that kind of fine carpentry skill and were already making furniture. So I have some distant cousins who have the town that they're in. It has a big furniture store and a big funeral parlor, and they're both run by the same family. And I'm sure that's the case in many small towns throughout the United States, just because there's a predictable relationship between those two professions, or at least there was at one point. There's an intermixture between history preserving and history erasing. Fish and dolphins' internal structures are different. That's a result of history, the historical process of evolution. Fish and dolphins are streamlined for going through the water. That's the laws of physics, driving any creature that lives in the water will will have a tendency to evolve toward being streamlined for its benefit. Fish and dolphins have deeper commonalities that go beyond the differences in their internal structure. And that's another historical fact because they're both evolved from the original ancestor of all vertebrates. There's also coincidences. The word cyberdyne and the word governor share a common root from the Greek, but that was not a predictor of Arnold Schwarzenegger's career. Here's an everyday example of what may appear to be a unpredictable chance event, chance annoyance. I spend a lot of time waiting for the bus to the daily parking lot at BWI. You wait and wait and wait. Buses go by for all the other lots, and finally, 2 or 3 buses going to the daily lot all come in one after another. Is this due to the specific things that happened that day? No, in fact, there's a memory erasing reason that you can predict that there will always end up being clusters of buses annoying you and making you wait. And the reason why is, even if the buses start out perfectly equally spaced, there will be contingent variation that will cause one of the buses to be late. A bus that's late gets to the stop late, which means that more people will generally have gotten to the stop before the bus arrives. Loading more people takes more time, so the bus is going to be even later. Meanwhile, the bus that's behind that one will arrive after a shorter time, and there will be very few people at the stop to be picked up, so that bus will get faster. And before long, you will end up with a bus cluster, and you'll end up with 3 buses going to the same location, all arriving within minutes of each other, even though it would be very convenient if they were spaced more evenly. That's just a result of positive feedback, and it's completely predictable, erasing all the history of what the original distribution of buses was when the day began. So how can you tell the difference? Well, first of all, you have to look for more data in a lot of cases. Does the same phenomena occur repeatedly in different cultures or in independent cases? Then you have to really start thinking about it being a history erasing process. If possible, run experiments like I did with my simulation. Look for possible feedback loops that could lock on to contingent events or drive systems to predictable and stable endpoints. That's the way you find out whether you're looking at a contingent situation requiring historical explanation, like the selection of pink for girls and blue for boys, which before the 20th century was not the way things worked. Before the 20th century, to the extent that there was any tradition at all, it was blue for girls, a natural, nice, feminine, light blue sky color, and a manly blood pink for boys. And that seemed perfectly natural to the people at the time. Or whether you're looking at a history erasing situation requiring a law-based explanation. A lot of tricks and scams rely on people misunderstanding which kind of explanation they should be looking for. A lot of you will have seen the kind of magic trick that involves the magician asking you to pick a random integer and then to do a lengthy sequence of arithmetical operations, multiplications, divisions, removing digits, adding digits. And the idea is that you're led to think that this is completely contingent and all these processes are going to make your answer even more random than your random guess was. But voila, the magician can tell the answer in advance using his magical power of knowing that the arithmetic operations he's asked you to do always produce the same number. You have a process that seems like it ought to produce a random result, producing an inevitable one. And it works the other way too. If you Google something called Penny's Game, it's what looks like a fair coin flipping game, relying on the fact that coin flipping seems like it should be a memory erasing, a memoryless process. But the way this game works, the process itself has memory, even if the coin doesn't have a memory, and you will lose a lot of money if you take the wrong bet in Penny's game. Finally, there's what you might call the third kind of explanation, or is it even an explanation at all? Consider these situations. Seriously ill people who visit the waters of a particular spring often recover. Generals who win 3 battles in a row often fail dramatically in their next battle. The person who does worst in last year's all-city chess tournament was in the 30th percentile this year, much better. And the county with the highest death rate from cancer this month has fewer cancer deaths next month. The thing that all these things have in common is that we are tempted to explain them. We are tempted to explain them with words like miracle or placebo effect or psychosomatic illness or hubris or complacency or failure-induced extra effort or really trying hard the next time, things like that. But none of these phenomena really need explanation because regression to the mean explains them all. Any extreme result, good or bad, is probably due to both an inherent characteristic and good or bad luck working together to produce that extreme effect. Later, the inherent characteristic may be the same, but the luck will be different. So no matter what you do, the next result will almost certainly be less extreme. Recognizing that this regression as expected is just not natural for people. And Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, has a lot of examples of this. And you can get seriously misled. People also underestimate the effect of sample size on experimental results, which is another statistical reason for making something look like it's a phenomenon that really deserves a historical or law-based reason when it doesn't. Here's a simple example of regression. I flipped five coins and I only got one head. Obviously, I needed to try harder to do better. I scolded myself quite firmly, and the next time I flipped the coins, I had 3 heads. Obviously, chiding myself helped me do better the second time. On the other hand, after I got 4 heads on one set of coin tosses, I praised my efforts, and the next toss I did worse. I only got 2 heads. So clearly I've learned that praising leads to degrading results and scolding leads to improved results. This is easily recognizable as ridiculous when you're doing it with a coin toss, but people can get seriously confused and decide that that yelling at people really does improve their performance and praising them does degrade it, when all that's happening is that the guy that you're yelling at had some bad luck and is probably not very good. And the next time he still wasn't very good, but had some less bad luck and so did better. Here are some references for further reading. Either they have something directly due to the concepts of the 2 kinds of explanation, or in my mind they're related. First of all, there's a couple of books by Stephen Jay Gould, who was a very firm believer in the importance of looking for contingent explanations. He talked about the metaphor of rewinding the tape and seeing a different process unfold just due to the way that contingent effects added up. There's a novel by Michael Kube McDowell, Alternatives, which is one of the best alternate history novels I've seen from the point of view of understanding the contingencies of history. There's a bunch of alternate histories all spawned out of changes that occurred around 1945. And by the early 80s, not only do you have a different list of presidents, but you have presidents whose names you don't even recognize as someone of any importance whatsoever. They're just a different set of circumstances led to different people even becoming considered to be president. There's a few. There's the Hugo-nominated Anxieties, the Dizziness of Freedom by Ted Chiang, which is a another excellent short story on the effect of contingency and law in alternate histories. Thinking Fast and Slow, I've already mentioned, by Daniel Kahneman. A short story by Greg Egan called Into Darkness talks a lot about memoryless processes. And finally, James McWhorter talks about contingency in linguistics. Why English won't and can't sit still. And some final quotes I have, first on the subject of law from Paul Anderson's Brainwave. Gravitation plus Coriolis force plus fluid friction plus temperature differential plus volcanism plus chemical reaction equals this is our world, and behold, she is very fair. Then history, from a book called 102 Minutes by Jim Dwyer and Kevin Flynn about the Twin Towers. Innocent people lived or died because they stepped back from a doorway or hopped onto a closing elevator or simply shifted their weight from one foot to another. And finally, a synthesis from Democritus, the Greek philosopher and scientist. Everything existing in the universe is the fruit of chance and necessity. Thank you very much. Now I think I'll look and see if there are any questions. All right. So I have a question from Roger Burns regarding designers. Is it fair to say that systems that involve non-thinking tools are better to be history erasing, while systems that involve thinking people are better to be history preserving? An educational system that assumes its audience always has to start at the one-on-one level for every class would be horrific, after all. Actually, that is a good point. You do want some aspects of history to be preserved. If you're designing a bureaucracy, you would expect it to you would want it to be built on history and to evolve towards to better and better working. I'm not sure whether that's really what I'm thinking of contingency. That does seem more like a law-based process moving towards a good answer. But bureaucracy does have its contingent effects where a certain form gets adopted because it was what someone was thinking of that day, and every other form that develops always includes that one question that you never understand why that question is even asked, and that's just because people copy from the past result. Let's see, and I've got some applause from Scott and Dave Smith, and I appreciate that. Any other questions? Phil Gutz asks, can we get a copy of the slides? And yes, I can send the slides out. I wonder if BartCon is a good site for me to locate them at. I will send that. I will open that up to the text to ask if they have a site I can send my slides to so people can look at them. Any other questions? Oh, yes, cool video. Beth Kingley says, can we see the cool video? And the answer is yes, we do have time. Let's see, share screen. So here's the video. Can you hear the sound on that? All right, so he's got a chain there, and look at how that chain is looping up to feed out of the thing, like it's being siphoned. That's a real effect. That's not not faked. All right. I got another question from someone who was actually in the room with me about what that Greek root meant, and it was the Greek word for governor. So it came. Excuse me for a second. The Greek root meant governor, and so it was adopted into the field of cybernetics because cybernetics was all about feedback systems used to govern processes like steam engines and such. And it also got into the political sense for governing. Let's see, any other questions? Scott Snell says, regression to the mean, the Golden State Warriors got much better rather suddenly and won the NBA title and then got even better the next season. And I also am hearing by, and yes, I sometimes I agree with Scott Snell that sometimes people do get better. And I've got a number of people asking whether the video will be made available online. The National Capital Area Skeptic Society has previously posted my slides on their YouTube channel from time to time for a previous talk I've given, and so they may be doing this again. I will find out about that. Rest assured, I'll find some way to make these slides available to people on a wide basis. And any other questions? I'm going to look at the chat. I've got. Oh yeah, sorry I didn't have the sound effects for the video, but you guys can go see it. I see I only have a few more minutes to go. So I think I will thank you all for coming to my first ever virtual BarchCon presentation, and I will let you go to the next event. And I hope you all enjoyed my talk. I really enjoyed giving it. I enjoyed your questions, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the convention. I'll be on a Doctor Who panel and a Isaac Asimov panel on Sunday and Monday. So looking forward to seeing you all there.